If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. In the fall of 1864, a quickly promoted Union general gazed over the fertile landscape of the Shenandoah Valley. Ulysses S. Grant ordered him to make the valley useless to the Confederates and drive Confederate General Jubal Early from the region. Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia depended on foodstuffs from the valley to support their resistance to Grant's assaults around Petersburg. If Grant's hand-picked commander could remove the rebel hold on the valley, the war would be brought to a quicker end. The man Grant chose to perform this task was Philip Sheridan. Philip Sheridan was increasingly seen as a man who got things done fast, a man who could think on his feet. He was small, 5'5" at most, and thin but wiry and broad-shouldered. His men called him Little Phil. On horseback, Sheridan appeared larger because his torso and arms were disproportionately long and his legs were short. He possessed incredible stamina that enabled him to function at a high level without sleep or food. For a man of slight stature, Sheridan's appearance was striking. With his heavy arched brows, piercing Tartar-like hazel eyes, chin beard, and curling mustache, he bore a strong resemblance to a Mongolian horse soldier. He kept his hair cropped short because he hated his curls. Someone once observed that his hair looked painted on. A Southern civilian declared Sheridan the most savage-looking man he had ever seen, but then related a kindness that Sheridan had shown him. Sheridan was born on March 6, 1831, yet there is debate as to where he was born. Sheridan wrote in his memoirs that he was born in Albany, New York. The town of Somerset, Ohio declared that he was born there. His mother once said Sheridan was born at sea when the family immigrated to the United States from Ireland, and some say he was born in Ireland. John and Mary Sheridan immigrated to America in 1831, the year of Philip's birth, at the urging of John's uncle, who had settled in Albany, New York. The family of 4, possibly 5 if Sheridan had indeed been born already, traveled from Dublin to Liverpool, then sailed for America. Sheridan may have emphasized Albany as his birthplace to ward off the stigma of being Irish because he was coming of age in the 1840s. The Irish potato famine brought a huge influx of Irish into the United States, and with that influx developed xenophobia that Sheridan probably tried to avoid. The Sheridans didn't stay long in Albany. They moved to Somerset, Ohio, where Philip would grow up. His father became a road builder, helping on the National Road and a few turnpikes. Since his father was away, Mary, the devout Catholic, raised her children somewhat by herself. Philip liked to play hooky from school in order to go fishing, and joined a faction of boys representing the west side of the town called the Pigfoots. Their enemy faction on the east side were the Turkeyfoots. In 1840, presidential hopeful Richard Johnson of Kentucky came to Somerset to campaign for the Democratic nomination, opposing President Martin Van Buren. Sheridan and some of the other boys who were Whigs went to hear the speech but hung back. Johnson began to make his rounds, shaking the hands of attendees. When he got to the group of boys, Sheridan's friends thrust him forward when Johnson stuck out his hand. Sheridan refused to shake it. Johnson asked why, and Sheridan defiantly stated, "Because I am a Whig." Johnson began to laugh and kept trying to shake the boy's hand, but when he realized it was useless, he declared, "Boys, give way and let the little Whig out. We can't force or coax him to shake hands with a Democrat." At 14, Sheridan took a job at a grocery and hardware store, jumping around to similar jobs until he became the head clerk and bookkeeper for a dry goods store. He had a knack for creating order and keeping track of things. Sheridan became interested in the military during the Mexican-American War, when he read stories about men from his community in the conflict. He and the other boys were too young to join, but they formed their own military group, calling themselves the Kosciuszko Braves, and wearing green uniforms and turbans with a black plume. Sheridan would often see a West Point cadet in town. That cadet was William T. Sherman. Sheridan decided he wanted to enter West Point Military Academy, and since he had become acquainted with a congressman during his time as a bookkeeper, he asked the politician to get him an appointment. But the congressman had already selected another boy. When that young man failed the entrance exam, Sheridan was selected to replace him, passing the exam and entering the Corps of Cadets in July 1848. Sheridan's roommate was Henry Slocum, a former schoolteacher. After 10 p.m., when all lights were to be extinguished, Sheridan would put a blanket over the window, and by the light of a single candle or lamp would be tutored by Slocum, particularly in algebra, a subject Sheridan struggled in. On the parade ground one day, Sheridan and the cadets were drilling when William Terrell, a cadet sergeant, ordered Sheridan to close up on the man beside him. Sheridan believed he was the requisite distance from the other cadet and declared, "I'll run you through," and brandished his bayonet. Sheridan returned to the ranks, but the animosity remained. The next day, Sheridan knocked Terrell upside the head, and a fight broke out that had to be stopped by an officer. Sheridan was suspended from West Point for 1 year, as opposed to being expelled, as many had been because of fighting. When Sheridan returned, he was now in the graduating class that included James McPherson, John Bell Hood, John Schofield, and Joshua Seal. Robert E. Lee was the new superintendent. He graduated 34th out of a class of 52. His first assignment as a brevet second lieutenant was at Fort Duncan in Texas. On the Texas frontier, Sheridan was continually on the move, chasing Indians that he could never engage with directly. He also became adept at hunting, supplying the 1st Infantry Regiment with wild game. He learned Spanish from a Mexican guide and captured and studied colorful birds living in the region. In November 1854, Sheridan was promoted to second lieutenant, no longer a brevet promotion, and transferred to the 4th U.S. Infantry stationed in California. Little Phil first traveled to New York, where he temporarily commanded a detachment of new recruits destined for California. The group then sailed for the Isthmus of Panama, crossing it in the insufferable July heat. Quickly upon reaching California, he was sent to the Oregon Territory to survey a railroad route. He would replace John Bell Hood as the head of the mounted escort for the expedition's leader. The leader was Major Gabriel Rains. When the group made it to the Columbia River, it was ordered to subdue some Yakima Indians who were rising up due to white encroachment on their land. The group found some Yakima, and Sheridan suggested to Rains that he could lead the dragoons into a canyon behind the Indians and trap the group between 2 U.S. forces. Rains rejected the suggestion, and the Yakima got away. Sheridan was irate at the inaction of Rains. In March 1856, Sheridan was given his first independent command in the form of a rescue mission to save some white settlers trapped in the Middle Cascades blockhouse. On the 27th, he chose 6 men to help him scout the Indian position. They got within sight of the enemy, and they began to taunt and shoot at the U.S. soldiers. One bullet grazed Sheridan's nose, while another one hit one of his comrades in the neck, severing his spinal cord. Despite his attempt, Sheridan couldn't bring the Indians to battle. He sent his report for the day's action, and then sat down to devise another plan to get to the blockhouse. The ship The Bell that brought Sheridan and his men to the current location brought a large flat-bottomed boat that he hoped to use to bring his men upriver, concealing themselves behind a 2-mile-long island in the middle of the waterway. He and his 40 dragoons quickly discovered that rapids prevented them from rowing it upriver. They had to drag the boat using ropes. While doing this, they ran into a camp of Native American women, whom they got to help pull the boat. They made it to the blockhouse without incident and rescued the settlers. On their way back, they discovered a group of Indians on the island, who claimed they had nothing to do with the fight on the 27th. Sheridan checked their muskets and discovered powder residue and put them under arrest. Later, Sheridan's commander held a court and found 9 of them guilty, and they were hanged. Sheridan and his command then moved to Fort Yamhill. An incident occurred on the station's parade ground when a medicine woman was killed, shot 16 times by tribesmen in retribution for a patient dying under the woman's care. The act of killing a doctor whose patient died was a custom of that particular tribe. Sheridan met with the Indians and demanded that they give up the 16 men responsible for the death of the woman. They refused, and Sheridan captured the entire camp, threatening them if they didn't turn over the perpetrators. The killers were surrendered, and Sheridan placed them in chains. While in the Northwest, Sheridan took a Native American lover, a woman named Sidney-O, the daughter of a Willamette Valley Indian chief. Sheridan spent the next few years in that territory, occupying the area and warding off Native American attacks. However, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln got elected as President of the United States, and the secession winter began. Southern soldiers began leaving the ranks as their states left the Union. Sheridan watched them walk away from the old army and join a new one. With officers leaving, it made way for quick promotion. Sheridan found himself going from a second lieutenant, which he had been for 8 years, and became a captain in just a few short months. He wanted to join the impending war, but needed to be relieved from his current duty station. His commanders sent Captain James Archer to replace him, but Sheridan refused to leave his post because he felt that Archer was too Southern in his leanings. He was right. Archer left the Army in July 1861 to join the Confederacy. Eventually, Sheridan was relieved by someone he trusted to be loyal to the Union, and he set off for the East. He traveled through his hometown, Somerset, Ohio, to visit family and friends. Sheridan wrote that he was untainted by politics, nor had it been disturbed by any discussion of the questions out of which the war grew. He told some friends and neighbors, "This country is too great and good to be destroyed." At the end of 1861, he reported to Jefferson Barracks outside of St. Louis, Missouri, but instead of getting a command, he was assigned to audit the department's disordered ledgers by Major General Henry Halleck. With millions of dollars unaccounted for, Sheridan needed to use his old bookkeeping skills to right some wrongs. The former department head, John C. Fremont, attempted to get an ironclad fleet to monitor the rivers. Overcharging the Army led to some businessmen and some soldiers pocketing the surplus. Sheridan found the fraud, and it resulted in Brigadier General Justice McKinstry being court-martialed, convicted of fraud, and dismissed from the Army. After that, Sheridan was made Chief Commissary and Chief Quartermaster of the Army of the Southwest under Brigadier General Samuel Curtis. As the Union Army in Missouri moved to approach the Confederate Army of Earl Van Dorn in early 1862, Sheridan built and set up mills to thresh corn and wheat to feed Curtis's army. He became a ruthless commissary quartermaster, but he kept the army fed. When some Union soldiers stole some Southern civilian horses and attempted to sell them to Sheridan, Sheridan discovered the ruse, confiscated the horses, and refused to pay the men. Curtis heard that Sheridan refused to pay the soldiers for resources they earned honestly and ordered Sheridan to pay them. Sheridan refused. "No authority can compel me to jayhawk or steal. If those under my supervision are allowed to do so, I respectfully ask the general to relieve me from duty in this district." Curtis wrote Sheridan up for disobedience of orders, but the charges were never brought against Sheridan, but Little Phil did return to St. Louis. Halleck assigned Sheridan the task of obtaining horses for the army in the Midwestern states along the Mississippi River. He found about 400 horses, but also heard about a bloody battle that happened in Tennessee. The Battle of Shiloh was a Union victory, and stories of the battle captivated Sheridan's mind. He raced back to St. Louis and called on Halleck to send him to Tennessee or Mississippi, but Halleck wasn't there. He was himself going to Tennessee to take control of the situation. Sheridan convinced the adjutant general in St. Louis to give him an assignment in Mississippi. This I consider the turning point in my military career, and shall always feel grateful to Colonel Kelton for his kindly act, which so greatly influenced my future. When Sheridan made it to Pittsburgh Landing, the site of the Battle of Shiloh, Halleck put him to work building corduroy roads toward Corinth, Mississippi. He was also brought in to bring order to Halleck's headquarters and paperwork. There he began to make friends with higher-ranking officers like William T. Sherman and Gordon Granger. Both men recommended him for field command, seeing his interest in such an assignment. Granger was finally able to get him named the commander of the 2nd Michigan Cavalry in May 1862 as a colonel. Within 2 weeks of becoming the colonel of that regiment, Sheridan was promoted to command of the entire brigade. Outside of Booneville, Sheridan's new command came under attack by a large Confederate cavalry force under James Chalmers. Sheridan's command was horribly outnumbered. He repeatedly called for reinforcements, but decided to take matters into his own hands, dispatching 2 companies to take a small trail and hit the rebels in the left flank and rear. Sheridan planned to hit the enemy on the flank and in the front at the same time. What aided the attack was the introduction of a train whistle sounding. The enemy and Sheridan's force thought it signaled Union reinforcements, but in reality the train contained feed for the horses in the Union Army. The combination of factors led to Sheridan defeating a much larger enemy in his first battle of the Civil War. Immediately, others began to recognize the skill and abilities of Sheridan. Major General William S. Rosecrans wrote, "More cavalry massed under such an officer will be of great use to us. Sheridan ought to be made a brigadier." Generals Gordon Granger, Horatio Wright, and Alexander Osboth signed an endorsement that stated, "Brigadiers are scarce, good ones scarcer." The undersigned urged the promotion of Sheridan. He is worth his weight in gold. Sheridan ought to be made a brigadier. Although the promotion didn't come in until September 13th, it dated from July 1st, making Sheridan a brigadier. On paper, Sheridan rose from captain to brigadier in about 6 weeks. Along with the promotion, Sheridan was ordered to join the Army of the Ohio as it chased the Confederate Army under Braxton Bragg into Kentucky. Before he left, the 2nd Michigan Cavalry presented him with a large black horse that stood 17 hands high. Sheridan named him Renzi after the town in Mississippi. Sheridan made it into Kentucky in time for the Battle of Perryville, where he was given command of a division under the command of Charles Gilbert. Sheridan attacked the Confederates at Doctors Creek, but under orders from his superiors, he didn't press the Confederates. He and his division didn't take part in the fiercest of the fighting on the Union left. In the battle, William Terrell, the man Sheridan fought at West Point and was suspended because of, was killed. The two men had forgiven each other a short time before the battle. Following the tactical defeat but strategic victory for the Union at Perryville, the Union Army moved back into Tennessee. Sheridan remained around Nashville as the Army got reorganized and named the Army of the Cumberland. He would now command a division in the right wing of the Army, led by Alexander McCook. The Army waited in Nashville, getting supplied for its push against Bragg's Army of Tennessee, camped in and around Murfreesboro, Tennessee. In late December, the Union Army lumbered out of Tennessee's capital and pushed southeastward. December 31st, 1862 had just been ushered in, and Sheridan and his friend and former West Point roommate, Joshua Seal, were talking. Seal now commanded a brigade in Sheridan's division. Both men heard the sounds of marching men coming from the enemy's lines. The new commander of the army, William S. Rosecrans, planned to strike the Confederate right flank later that morning, but Sheridan feared that they would be attacked before Rosecrans' plan could come to fruition. Sheridan and Seal alerted their wing commander, McCook, but he brushed off the threat, saying in a few hours the rebels would have their hands full with the Union's own attack. Sheridan and Seal refused to discount what they heard, and Sheridan readied his entire division for a possible attack, unlike the rest of the wing. A massive Confederate assault caved in the extreme right flank of the Union Army. For the most part, Sheridan's division was the only one to make a determined stand, but it cost Sheridan his friend and brigade commander Joshua Seal. He was killed early in the attack. With the units on his right and left caving in, Sheridan had to pull back. He and his men hunkered down in a limestone outcropping near a cedar break that would be forever known as the Slaughter Pen. With his single division, Sheridan held out against repeated assaults by multiple Confederate divisions. He moved from flank to flank, inspiring his men to hold the ground, giving enough time for the Army commander to restore order closer to the Nashville Pike, the link between the Army and Nashville. One newspaper correspondent remarked that Sheridan was more than magnetic, he was electric. His men began to run out of ammunition and realized he couldn't hold the position any longer without disaster befalling his entire command, so he begrudgingly fell back. As he got closer to the Nashville Pike, Rosecrans found him. Sheridan was cursing as his men withdrew and the rebels pressed them. Rosecrans, a very religious man, remarked, "Remember, the first bullet may send you to eternity." Sheridan pulled his division back to the Pike and defended it against more rebel attacks. New Year's Day brought no major action as both armies assessed the situation. January 2nd saw fighting on the Union left. Sheridan's men played no significant role. The engagement ended with the Confederates unable to move the Union Army from the field. Sheridan's division was devastated by the fight. Thousands of men were casualties, and all 3 of Sheridan's brigade commanders had been killed. Following the battle, the army was reorganized. Sheridan's wing, commanded by McCook, was now dubbed the 20th Corps, and new brigade commanders were chosen for Sheridan's division. Sheridan had learned to command a division quickly, and he threw himself into his duties like he always did. He wrote, "I had to study hard to be able to master all the needs of such a force to feed and clothe it, and guard all its interests. When undertaking these responsibilities, I felt that if I met them faithfully, recompense would surely come through the hearty response that soldiers always make to conscientious exertion on the part of their superiors." He expected discipline. When it was found that multiple officers abandoned their colors and their men at Stone's River, he made a disgraceful spectacle of them. The whole division formed a hollow square. The cowardly officers were ordered to hand their swords over to Sheridan's black servant because Sheridan didn't want to humiliate any soldier by touching the sullied weapons. Then the servant cut the ranks off their uniforms, and now former officers were drummed out of the division. Acting Quartermaster Sergeant of the 73rd Illinois, Henry Castle, rode to division headquarters one day and nearly ran over a man in his shirt sleeves, sitting on a stump and smoking a cigar. The man in his shirt sleeves asked who Castle was, and he told him that he needed advice on obtaining cattle. The man puffed on his cigar and commenced to tell him how to go about getting the cattle, butchering them, and distributing them. As they talked, an officer came up to the man in his shirt sleeves and saluted him, addressing him as General Sheridan. Castle apologized for his actions, hoping not to be punished for his words. Sheridan was modest. He told the man not to worry. How could he have known his rank? He didn't have his coat on. After assuaging Castle's fears, the acting quartermaster sergeant went on his way. By the summer of 1863, the Army of the Cumberland began its move against its nemesis in what became the Tullahoma Campaign, pressing the Confederates through Middle Tennessee and all the way to Chattanooga. Rosecrans dispatched Sheridan to Bridgeport, Alabama to help construct a bridge. Bridging started on August 29th and finished on September 1st, an incredible feat. The respected Union Major General George Thomas was traveling with Sheridan aboard a train to look over the bridge. As the two men talked, the train came to a stop. Sheridan went to the conductor and demanded the train to be started forward, but he refused, saying he only took orders from the military railroad superintendent. Sheridan punched him 3 or 4 times and kicked him off the train, then ordered the train moving. The Army of the Cumberland then began their journey over Lookout Mountain into Georgia and around Chattanooga, finding the Confederates had left the city. Sheridan utilized local scouts with partiality to East Tennesseans who were proud Union men to find the Confederate forces once his men got through the mountains. Sheridan's force was on the right or southern flank of the army when it got into northern Georgia, and Rosecrans called for the army to concentrate. On September 18th, fighting began along Chickamauga Creek around the 14th Corps led by George Thomas. The rest of the army moved to give him aid. Sheridan's division came up the Lafayette Road and engaged with Confederate right, holding them in place until nightfall brought an end to the fighting in his sector. The next day, the Confederates planned to launch a massive assault spearheaded by James Longstreet, newly arrived from Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. When the Union division of Thomas Wood mistakenly moved and created a gap in the Union battle line, Longstreet's men attacked through it, splitting the Federal line in half. Sheridan's men got battered unmercifully. With his flanks caved in and his brigade commanders being shot down, he had no choice but to pull back. He met with Rosecrans, who told him to move to the Dry Valley Road and guard it, as it was the fastest route for the retreating Union army to make it back to Chattanooga. Sheridan formed what was left of his division and did as he was told. As he moved toward Chattanooga, he got word that Thomas was holding what was left of the Union army together on Horseshoe Ridge and Snodgrass Hill. Sheridan went to Rossville, north of Thomas's position, then doubled back, putting himself in supporting distance of the Virginian. When he asked Thomas how he could help, Thomas told him to cover his withdrawal, which he did. On the way to Rossville during the withdrawal, Sheridan and Thomas came together. Sheridan made them a seat from a fence rail. They sat down, and Sheridan waited for Thomas to speak, but he just stared in silence. According to Sheridan, Thomas looked very much exhausted, seemed to forget what he stopped for, and said little or nothing of the incidents of the day, his quiet, unobtrusive demeanor communicating a gloomy rather than a hopeful view of the situation. The Army of the Cumberland streamed into Chattanooga and prepared its defenses. The Confederates sluggishly pursued and began occupying the ridges and mountains surrounding the city, laying siege to it. Sheridan settled in with the rest of his division for a rough couple of months. While being besieged at Chattanooga, Sheridan made his headquarters at the home of William Crutchfield, a proud Union man. The Union Army of the Cumberland was besieged, but a trickle of supplies made it into the city. Sheridan's former commissary days led him to send the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry and his scout and intelligence agent James Card into the Sequatchie Valley to gather food for his command. This was done and arguably made Sheridan's division one of the best fed divisions in the army during the siege. The 2nd Kentucky had unofficially attached themselves to Sheridan's command and enjoyed the duty. In October 1863, Ulysses S. Grant, commander of Union forces in the Western Theater, arrived to relieve the Army of the Cumberland commander, William S. Rosecrans, and replace him with the Rock of Chickamauga, George Thomas. Using Rosecrans's plan to open up a supply line, Grant authorized the capture of Brown's Ferry and Lookout Valley, leading to what became known as the Cracker Line to get supplies into the city from Bridgeport, Alabama. Grant massed part of his two other armies in Chattanooga, the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the Mississippi. The next step involved throwing back the Confederates from around the ridges and mountains around Chattanooga. In late November, Sheridan and the Army of the Cumberland finally left their entrenchments and attacked the small Confederate force guarding Orchard Knob, a high point between the city and Missionary Ridge. Sheridan's men quickly captured it, securing it for the Union. Other troops captured Lookout Mountain and the north end of Missionary Ridge. The final step in defeating the rebels was to capture the ridge fully. Grant wanted the Army of the Cumberland to put pressure on the Confederates on that ridge by capturing the rifle pits at the bottom of it. On November 25th, the signal gun fired, and Sheridan led his men to the rifle pits, capturing them with the bayonet. The rebels scrambled up the ridge to get to safety, with many of Sheridan's and other Federal soldiers giving chase. Sheridan sent a courier to ask his corps commander, Gordon Granger, whether they were to stop at the rifle pits or go further. Word came back that he was supposed to stop at the rifle pits, but Sheridan saw his men climbing the large ridge and decided not to stop their momentum. He ordered his men forward, which they did with a cheer and a shout. The force from the Army of the Cumberland climbed the preeminence. As his men neared the top, Sheridan asked one of his staff officers for his flask. He saw some rebels in front of Confederate Army Commander Braxton Bragg's headquarters, waved the flask at the group of men and shouted, "Here's at you," then took a drink. 2 cannons fired on the 2 men, kicking up dirt in their faces. Sheridan exclaimed, "That is ungenerous," and declared, "I shall take those guns for that." As his men swarmed over the ridge, cheers sprang up for the monumental task that the Army of the Cumberland had performed. Sheridan dismounted his horse Renzi, and as he did, an artillery blast slightly wounded the animal. While Renzi recovered, Sheridan rode a gray horse taken from one of the staff officers to Confederate General John C. Breckinridge. Because of that, Sheridan named the horse Breckinridge and would use it as a second mount. As the Confederates retreated, Sheridan pursued. He even went to Granger and asked for the rest of the corps to chase after the retreating foe, but Granger thought the men had done enough for the day and for them to rest. When Sheridan persisted, Granger told him he could continue the pursuit. Sheridan drove the Confederates across Chickamauga Creek, but because the rest of the corps wasn't with him, it would be dangerous to go any further. His men rested near Chickamauga Station. Grant learned about Sheridan's actions and remarked, "With the instinct of military genius, Sheridan pushed ahead. If others had followed his example, we should have had Bragg's army. And, to Sheridan's prompt movement, the Army of the Cumberland and the nation are indebted for the bulk of the captured prisoners, artillery, and small arms that day. Except for his prompt pursuit, so much in this way would not have been accomplished." When Sheridan returned to Missionary Ridge, he found that William B. Hazen's brigade now claimed the 11 artillery pieces that Sheridan believed he and his division had captured. Hazen and Sheridan would feud over who reached the top of Missionary Ridge first and who captured the guns for more than 30 years after the conflict ended. Sheridan and his men were given no time to rest, as they were dispatched north to Knoxville, Tennessee, to help lift the siege of that city. Confederate General James Longstreet unsuccessfully attacked Knoxville's fortifications and had withdrawn east toward Morristown and Rogersville. Sheridan and his division pursued to Strawberry Plains, but no further. After camping there for a short time, they moved southwest of Knoxville to Loudon. After Grant successfully ended the siege of Chattanooga, Abraham Lincoln promoted him to lieutenant general and general-in-chief of all Union armies. Grant put his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac in the east. That army's cavalry was led by Alfred Pleasonton, and although he had a few successes, the Union cavalry in the east were lackluster, somewhat as a result of how the army wanted to use them. Pleasonton would be transferred across the Mississippi River and a new cavalry commander chosen. Grant threw a few names around of generals that would make capable commanders, but at the urgence of Henry Halleck, Sheridan was chosen to lead the cavalry corps. Grant declared that he had wanted Sheridan in that position all along, after seeing his aggressiveness at Missionary Ridge. Sheridan received the news to report to Washington, and although he didn't know the reasoning yet, he guessed it probably meant severing ties with his old division. He didn't want his emotions to get the better of him, so he resolved to leave without saying goodbye. But at the Loudon train station, he found his division on the hillside saying their farewells. At Chattanooga, George Thomas informed him of his new assignment, commander of the Army of the Potomac's cavalry. Sheridan wrote, "The information staggered me at first. I felt loath to undergo the trials of the new position." In Washington, Sheridan met with Henry Halleck, Edwin Stanton, and Abraham Lincoln, getting briefed on the situation in Virginia and with the Army of the Potomac. A War Department official remarked to Grant, "The officer you brought on from the West is rather a little fellow to handle your cavalry." Grant replied, "You will find him big enough for the purpose before we get through with him." Sheridan had new ideas for the cavalry. The Army of the Potomac usually used cavalry for picket duty and guarding wagon trains and communications. Sheridan noticed this was wearing out the horses and went to the Army's commander, George Meade. They got into a serious discussion about the uses of the mounted arm. Sheridan suggested using the cavalry as a concentrated force to eliminate the rebel cavalry. With the Confederates suffering a major loss to their cavalry, communications and supply lines would be vulnerable to an attack by the Union cavalry. Meade didn't like the idea of changing the role of his horsemen, but did take the cavalry off the picket line to give the horses a break and time to recuperate before the next campaign. Sheridan's first move as cavalry corps commander was to guard the crossings at Ely and Germanna Fords and help prepare a way for the infantry to cross at those locations. Once across, the Army of the Potomac entered the wilderness, the location where Robert E. Lee, the Confederate Army commander, knew that the superior numbers of the Federals would be reduced because of the terrain. As the two armies slugged it out in the Battle of the Wilderness, Sheridan's men protected the left flank and rear of the army, coming into contact with the rebel cavalry. The most significant engagement for Sheridan in this new role was at Todd's Tavern, where his cavalry struggled but succeeded in throwing back the Confederates. At the end of the destructive Battle of the Wilderness, Sheridan again prepared to make a way for the Union Army to press on to the southeast at Spotsylvania Court House. He immediately ran into rebel cavalry, who also attempted to block their counterparts and secure a defensive location for their own army. When he tried to secure a bridgehead across the Po River, the message was slow in getting to his subordinates. Before they could receive Sheridan's message, Meade redirected the cavalry to press down the Brock Road in front of the 5th Corps. This infuriated Sheridan, who knew that the bridges were much more important than preceding the 5th Corps. He wrote in his memoirs, "Had Gregg and Merritt been permitted to proceed as they were originally instructed, it is doubtful whether the battles fought at Spotsylvania would have occurred. Instead, the Confederates' approach to the town was entirely unobstructed, while 3 divisions of cavalry remained practically ineffective by reason of disjointed and irregular instructions." Following the miscommunication, Meade and Sheridan got into a shouting match at the former's headquarters. Meade charged him with making serious mistakes and clogging the road that prevented the infantry from stealing a march on the Confederates. Sheridan responded, "I could whip Jeb Stuart if you would only let me, but since you insist on giving the cavalry directions without consulting or even notifying me, you could henceforth command the cavalry corps." Sheridan then stormed out of Meade's tent. Meade then went to Grant and told him about the fight. When Meade told Grant about Sheridan claiming he could whip Jeb Stuart, Grant responded, "Did Sheridan say that? Well, he generally knows what he is talking about. Let him start right out and do it." Shortly after the meeting between Grant and Meade ended, Sheridan was ordered to set out and make a direct attack on the Confederate cavalry. On May 9th, the 13-mile-long column of nearly 10,000 horsemen and 32 artillery pieces traveled south on the Telegraph Road that ran from Fredericksburg to Richmond. Stuart's cavalry mirrored the movement, riding behind and to the west of Sheridan's column. Stuart had to leave part of his command at Spotsylvania Court House because he wasn't sure of Sheridan's intentions, and if Sheridan turned back to hit Lee in the rear, his cavalry would be waiting. After crossing the South Anna River, Sheridan's men rested, but Stuart's men continued south, trying to get in front of Sheridan's columns. They did, interposing themselves between the Federal horsemen and the Confederate capital. Stuart formed his defensive line at a little place called Yellow Tavern. Sheridan scouted Stuart's position himself and then ordered his troops in. A bloody engagement raged as the blue-coated soldiers repeatedly attacked the Confederate line, sometimes being repulsed and sometimes gaining a lodgment, then, through a Confederate counterattack, were pushed back again. Finally, Sheridan broke through Stuart's left flank, forcing the Confederates to form a new line. Sheridan formed up his men for another assault, which pounded the Confederates relentlessly. One of Sheridan's brigades under George Armstrong Custer broke through the Confederate line, and Stuart attempted to rally his men and plug the hole, but when he did, one of Custer's men shot Stuart in his right side, above the belt, mortally wounding the famed Cavalier. The Confederate line broke and Sheridan swept it from the field. The Federals rode toward Richmond, then darted to the east toward the Chickahominy River. They needed to cross it, but Confederate cavalry guarded the north bank and militia and regular Confederate infantry were coming out of Richmond. Sheridan fought on two flanks as his men scoured the countryside looking for materials to place across the ties of a train trestle that crossed the river. The Confederate infantry came close to Sheridan's lines, but he was able to hold them off and send them into a retreat. The Federal horsemen got across the river and rested at Walnut Grove and Gaines' Mill. Sheridan's men then recrossed the Chickahominy at Bottom's Bridge and made it to Haxall's Landing on the James River, where he could get resupplied and unload his wounded to be cared for by the Army of the James, commanded by Benjamin Butler. After the resupply, Sheridan moved his command back to the Army of the Potomac with a delighted Grant waiting for him. Grant realized the importance of the raid and the abilities of Sheridan. Sheridan's men quickly took to him. He gave them victories and they loved him for it. One officer wrote about Sheridan that he wore the uniform of a major general, but there was no constraint in his manner in talking to us, although our rank was but that of captains, nor on the other hand did we feel any reserve towards him on account of his rank. He came into the tent an utter stranger, and in less than an hour both of us not only believed in him, but felt an affection for him. I thought this very strange, this love at first sight, and without apparent reason. Soon, however, I found that others felt much as I did, that we had a personal ownership in him, that he would at all times acknowledge, and this without any feeling of superiority. Grant now had another expedition for Sheridan to undertake, go around Richmond, destroy the Virginia Central Railroad, and meet up with Union General David Hunter and his army at Charlottesville. From there, Hunter and Sheridan would press on to Richmond, destroying as much infrastructure as possible to hopefully bring the war in the East to an early close. Sheridan and the Cavalry Corps set off, but they were followed closely by Lee's cavalry and infantry destined for the Shenandoah Valley. Wade Hampton and Fitzhugh Lee were able to get the rebel horsemen in between Sheridan and a station on the Virginia Central Railroad called Trevilian Station. With Hampton and Lee blocking his path, Sheridan resolved to push through them. Despite their superior firepower, the Federals had difficulties pushing back the rebels. Sheridan sent Custer and his brigade around the flank of the Confederates, and they found the wagon train. Custer quickly captured it, but came under attack. He determined to make a stand, and Sheridan, watching from afar, began pushing his men forward to hopefully save Custer from annihilation. Sheridan was able to push Hampton and Lee from the field, saving Custer, but the next day failed at removing the Confederates from their next position. A little of the railroad was destroyed, but it was quickly repaired. Sheridan found that Hunter was now marching toward Lynchburg, but so was a large infantry force from Richmond. He failed in his two objectives, destroy the railroad and link up with Hunter, so Sheridan pulled back to Grant. Along the way, Sheridan's horseflesh was worn out from the constant riding. The cavalrymen took new mounts from the Virginia homes they passed. Enslaved men, women, and children began to walk with the Blue Column, hoping to escape their bondage. When Sheridan finally made it to Grant, he assigned him to escort the wagon train across the James River. The siege of Petersburg had begun. By this point in 1864, the Eastern Theater saw constant movement of Union and Confederate forces, but nothing decisive, and worse, the Confederates made bold attacks. Grant pushed Lee to Richmond and Petersburg, but failed to destroy the Army of the Potomac, and Jubal Early, now commanded the Confederate Army in the Shenandoah Valley, had pressed all the way to Washington, D.C., and created havoc in Maryland and Pennsylvania. Early's expeditions diverted manpower and attention to activities along the Potomac River, including troops from the Petersburg front. A Confederate army operating in Union territory could spell political disaster for the Lincoln administration in the upcoming presidential election. For the Union, the Shenandoah Valley was a thorn in their side since the early days of the war. It gave vast amounts of supplies to the Confederacy, and if Robert E. Lee and his army was going to be stopped, a disruption in those supplies needed to happen. Thus far, Confederate forces threw Union generals out of that region, with Early running roughshod over the Federal forces. Ulysses S. Grant proposed to unite the commands operating in the valley under one determined man to eliminate Early. Grant conversed with Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton about who they should choose as that commander. Grant first suggested William B. Franklin, but Lincoln shot that idea down quickly because of that general's actions at Fredericksburg. Next, they discussed placing George Meade as command of that army, taking him away from the Army of the Potomac, but they felt that removal of Meade from the command of the Union's principal army would reflect badly and imply that Lincoln disapproved of Meade's generalship. The third option was Philip Sheridan. At first, Lincoln and Stanton believed Sheridan too young at 33, so they wanted David Hunter, an old general and someone already familiar with the valley, to share command. They agreed. Sheridan went to Washington to get his new assignment. The day after Sheridan met with the President and the Secretary, Grant met with Hunter, and it was agreed to halt any further action toward a shared command. Sheridan would have free rein over the Union forces opposing Early in the valley. Afterward, Grant met with Sheridan. He told him, "Follow Early to the death." He added that all grains and livestock and other supplies that could aid the Army of Northern Virginia should be taken or destroyed to prevent it from getting into rebel hands. Grant told Sheridan to spare civilian houses, but tell them to expect raids like this until Confederate armies would no longer want to come into the valley for sustenance. Sheridan now commanded an army of 40,000 men to rid the valley of Confederate forces and foodstuffs. Along with this army, a young man joined Sheridan's staff. His name was John Meigs, the son of the Union Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs. John was 22 and had just graduated from West Point in 1863, but he was a topographical expert. In a rundown hotel in Harper's Ferry, Meigs tutored Sheridan on the Shenandoah Valley's terrain. Sheridan remembered, "It has always come rather easy to learn the geography of a new section, and its important topographical features as well. The region in which I was to operate would soon be well fixed in my mind." For the first several weeks, Sheridan's force remained idle at the north end of the valley. Union citizens and politicians began to think that the administration and Grant had chosen the wrong man for the job. It appeared, at least from the outside, that Sheridan was too timid to command. In reality, Sheridan was learning the terrain and preparing his infantry and cavalry to work together. His cavalry went out and formed a perimeter around his army, skirmishing basically every day with their Confederate counterparts. In September, an older black man came to a Quaker school taught by a young lady named Rebecca Wright. The black man's name was Thomas Laws. Laws had been permitted to travel into Winchester to sell vegetables, but he wasn't selling vegetables today. He carried in his mouth a note encased in a piece of tinfoil. He went to Miss Wright and gave her the message. It was from Sheridan, asking her, because of her Unionist sympathies, to tell him the disposition and strength of Early's army. She wrote back a note, telling Sheridan that at least an infantry division and some cavalry had recently left Early's command, but she wasn't aware of any other information. But she would collect information, and when Laws returned, she would give Sheridan all the information she could. Sheridan liked the report from Miss Wright. He wanted that infantry to get far enough away that they couldn't quickly return to aid Early when Sheridan unleashed his army. On September 17th, Sheridan rode to Charlestown to meet with Grant. The two men talked about Sheridan's plan to send Early out of the valley. Impressed with Sheridan's excitement and enthusiasm, Grant decided not to put forward his own plan that he had in his pocket. Grant never brought up his ideas and simply told Sheridan, "Go in." Sheridan planned to attack Early on September 19th. Early divided his force with half near Winchester and the other half on its way to Martinsburg. If Sheridan acted quickly, he could attack one half with a 20-to-1 superiority in numbers. Early quickly realized the peril half his army was in. Sheridan was marching to the half at Winchester. Sheridan hoped to use two of his corps to break the Confederate line and slam the door of retreat closed with a third. However, the 6th Corps, commanded by Horatio Wright, brought its wagon train, delaying the 19th Corps from getting to the field in time. Sheridan rode up to Wright's wagons and ordered them into the ditches so the other corps could pass. They did so, but it was too late. Early had concentrated his army. Sheridan regrouped and came up with another plan. He would overwhelm Early's left flank and use his cavalry to prevent the Confederate retreat. Before he sent in his infantry, a rebel shell screeched through the air and landed beneath Renzi, Sheridan's horse, and exploded. Both horse and rider survived the close encounter. Sheridan remarked, "Close, but we'll lick hell out of 'em yet." Sheridan was right. He delivered a 1-2 punch with his infantry and cavalry, sending Early's army into a retreat. But he wasn't able to close the door on the rebel retreat. They got away to fight another day, but Sheridan claimed a great victory with thousands of prisoners taken. George Armstrong Custer remarked to an officer, "Major, this is the bulliest day since Christ was born." Following the victory, Sheridan went to the home of Rebecca Wright and personally thanked her for the information that helped lead to the great victory. The tide seemed to be turning against the Confederates in the valley, who had held dominion of the valley for so long. Sheridan moved quickly to follow up his victory. Early moved a few miles to the south to Fisher's Hill, prepared to defend against the pursuing Federals. Sheridan moved the 8th Corps secretly around the flank of Early's battle line and launched his attack, sending Early into another rout. 2 victories in a matter of days rose the spirits of the Union. Sheridan telegraphed Grant about Fisher's Hill, and Grant responded, "Keep on, and your work will cause the fall of Richmond." Although Sheridan enjoyed 2 victories, he felt they were incomplete. 2 times he attempted to cut off the retreat of the enemy, and 2 times he had failed to do so. This second time, he could point to Cavalry Division Commander William Averill as one of the main culprits in not continuing the pursuit of the rebels. At the beginning of Sheridan's campaign, Grant gave Sheridan the authority to remove Averill if the horsemen proved ineffective. Sheridan wasted no time, now that he had ammunition with which to remove Averill, and he did. In an uncharacteristic move for Sheridan, especially since he began his offensive, Sheridan pulled back northward to Strasburg. When he informed Grant of the movement, Grant didn't like it, but went along with Sheridan's plan. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. After the first couple of battles with Jubal Early at Winchester and Fisher's Hill, Sheridan began to lay waste the Shenandoah Valley, burning fields and killing livestock that could make it into the Confederate Army's hands. For the residents of the valley, they called it the burning. Sheridan remarked, "I do not hold war to mean simply that lines of men shall engage each other in battle. This is but a duel, in which one combatant seeks the other's life. War means much more, and is far worse than this. Death is popularly considered the maximum punishment in war, but it is not. Reduction to poverty brings prayers for peace more surely and more quickly than does the destruction of human life." One of the biggest thorns in Sheridan's side was Mosby's Rangers in and around Loudoun County, Virginia. The Confederate partisan ranger, John Singleton Mosby, was a skilled scout and raider, constantly providing annoyances to the Union armies who moved around his region that became known as Mosby's Confederacy. Sheridan and Mosby jousted back and forth, taking retribution as each side committed acts against one another, and Sheridan attacked civilians' livelihoods. One of, if not the worst moment of Sheridan's time in the valley was when his topographical engineer, John Meigs, whom Sheridan had come to care about like a son, rode up to some Union troopers on his way back to camp. The troopers weren't Union men, they were Confederate scouts wearing blue. The rebels took advantage of the situation and ordered the men to surrender. One of the survivors of the incident returned to Sheridan and told the general that the raiders had shot Meigs after he had surrendered. In anger, Sheridan ordered all the homes burned within 5 miles of the incident, which included the town of Dayton. Union soldiers moved into the town and informed its populace of what was to happen to their homes. Women flung their arms around the necks of the blue soldiers, begging them to have mercy, but they had to follow orders. They did, however, help the people move their belongings out of the homes. Being informed of what was happening to their homes, the Confederates released one of their prisoners to tell Sheridan the true story. The released prisoner told Sheridan that the rest of the company tried to surrender, but Meigs had drawn his pistol and fired, hitting one of the Confederates. This resulted in those men firing back at Meigs and killing him. Sheridan must have believed the story because he put a stop to the order to burn the houses within 5 miles of the incident. However, the Virginia civilians didn't get off without retribution. Sheridan ordered just the homes in the general vicinity of Meigs' death to be burned. At Woodstock, Virginia, Sheridan reported to Grant, "In moving back to this point, the whole country from the Blue Ridge to the North Mountain has been made untenable for a rebel army. I have destroyed over 2,000 barns filled with wheat, hay, and farming implements, over 70 mills filled with flour and wheat, have driven in front of the army over 40,000 head of stock, and have killed and issued to the troops not less than 3,000 sheep. Tomorrow I will continue the destruction of wheat, forage, etc., down to Fisher's Hill. When this is completed, the valley from Winchester up to Stanton, 92 miles, will have but little in it for man or beast. Along with Mosby's raiders that gave Sheridan a headache, Thomas Rosser's Laurel Brigade of cavalry constantly harassed the Union column, capturing wagons, soldiers, and slowing the progress of Sheridan's army. Sheridan grew irate at his own cavalry's inability to stop Rosser. On the night of October 8th, Sheridan went to the headquarters of Alfred Torbert, his cavalry commander, and found the general and his staff eating a turkey dinner. Sheridan burst out, "If you ain't sitting here stuffing yourselves, General, staff and all, while the rebels are riding into our camp, having a party while Rosser is carrying off your guns, got in your nice clothes and clean shirts. Torbert, mount quicker than hell will scorch a feather. I want you to go out there in the morning and whip that rebel cavalry, or get whipped yourself." On October 9th, the Union cavalry and their rebel counterparts fought at the Battle of Tom's Brook. Rosser's cavalry were driven from the field in what became known as the Woodstock Races. The defeat was a blemish on Rosser, Early, and the Confederacy, but it allowed Sheridan to gain an important hold on the valley by eliminating a lot of the enemy's cavalry. A few days later, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton called on Sheridan to come to Washington to discuss further operations, before Stanton sailed for City Point and met with Grant. Sheridan placed his army along Cedar Creek. His left flank was weaker than his right, but it was buttressed by mountains, and that's the way he left it as he moved toward Washington. The Confederates made a dawn attack on October 19th against Sheridan's weak left flank and caved it in, rolling up the Union battle line, sending 2 of Sheridan's corps skedaddling for the rear, nearly 20,000 men. Jubal Early gambled with this bold move, attacking a numerically superior enemy, and his gamble was paying off. However, he stopped at about 7:30 a.m., with part of the 6th Corps still on the field confronting them. This one mistake would doom all of the success that Early achieved thus far. The day before, Sheridan had rushed back from Washington and made it to Winchester, Virginia. The morning of the 19th, a courier came to Sheridan to report artillery fire near Cedar Creek. Sheridan was unconcerned, knowing that part of his army was launching some reconnaissance that morning. Still, Sheridan wanted to reach his troops. Sheridan mounted his horse and rode toward the sounds of battle. It grew louder as he moved further and further south. The stream of soldiers indicated that something horrible had befallen his army. He urged his horse Renzi to go faster, and the animal broke into that long swinging gallop, almost a run, which he seemed to maintain so easily and so endlessly, a most distressing gait for those who had to follow far. As he rode past a colonel, the officer yelled, "We're whipped." Sheridan replied, "You are, but the army isn't." Sheridan encouraged the stragglers, yelling, "About face, boys. We are going back to our camps. We are going to lick them out of their boots. Boys, turn back. Face the other way. I'm going to sleep in that camp tonight or in hell." Men began to rally. Loud cheers roared over the Virginia landscape as the Union troops saw their commander riding into battle. Sheridan shouted encouragement to them, and the men knew that the battle was turning into their favor with their general on the scene. One officer said, "Hope and confidence returned at a bound. Now we all burned to attack the enemy, to drive him back, to retrieve our honor, and sleep in our camps that night, and every man knew that Sheridan would do it." Sheridan quickly got to work assembling his battle line to launch a counterattack against Early's rebels. Officers suggested that he ride in front of the entire battle line to show all the men that he was there and to reassure them of success. Sheridan at first declined, but then agreed, stopping at each unit and telling them, "We'll whip 'em like hell before night, and we'll raise them out of their boots before the day is over." The Confederates launched a light probe at the reformed Union line. It was easily thrown back, and Sheridan stated, "Thank God for that. Now then, tell General Emory if they attack him again to go after them, and to follow them up, and to sock it to them, and to give them the devil. We'll get the tightest twist on them yet that you ever saw. We'll have all those camps and cannon back again." By mid-afternoon, Sheridan ordered his men to launch their attack. A gap in the Confederate line welcomed the blue-clad soldiers' attack, and they burst through the gap, separating the wings of the Confederate battle line. The rebels crumbled and began to run for the rear, with Sheridan urging his men to continue to pursue them. The Union horsemen captured prisoners and wagons, with one of the prisoners being Confederate Major General Stephen Dodson Ramseur. Ramseur was shot through both lungs as his men stood defiantly against Sheridan's attack. Ramseur was taken to the Belgrove plantation and laid on his deathbed in the library. Friends from West Point and the old army came to visit him, including Sheridan and George Armstrong Custer. Ramseur died the next morning. As the battle wore down, the Union Army had to stop the pursuit as it had gotten dark. A bonfire was built, and Sheridan and some officers were standing around it discussing the day and celebrating the victory. Custer came riding up about 9 p.m., jumped off his horse, grabbed Sheridan by the waist and lifted him up, exclaiming, "By God, Phil, we've cleaned them out of their guns and got ours back." One historian explains the importance of the Battle of Cedar Creek to Sheridan. The rare 11th hour victory transformed Sheridan into one of the nation's best-known military leaders literally overnight. In Washington, D.C., citizens paraded by torchlight through the White House grounds in homage to Sheridan and his men. Standing at an open window under the White House portico, President Abraham Lincoln proposed 3 cheers for Sheridan, adding, "While we are at it, we may as well consider how fortunate it was for the Secesh that Sheridan was a very little man. If he had been a large man, there is no knowing what he would have done with them." A poem was written entitled Sheridan's Ride to commemorate the victory as well. He was also promoted to Major General in the regular army for his actions. The Assistant War Secretary Charles Dana, who delivered his promotion personally, rode through the camps of the Army of the Shenandoah with Sheridan. He remarked, "Everybody seemed personally to be attached to him. He was like the most popular man after an election. The whole force everywhere honored him." Dana asked Sheridan about the honoring, and Sheridan replied, "My practice has always been to fight in the front rank. It is the right thing to do. The men know that when the hard pinch comes, I am exposed just as much as any of them." After defeating Jubal Early at the Battle of Cedar Creek, that Confederate army became less of a concern to Philip Sheridan, who began to expand his reach and attack other points. He turned his attention to Loudoun County, Virginia, known as Mosby's Confederacy because of the partisan ranger John Singleton Mosby's control of the area. Sheridan wrote to Washington, "I will soon commence on Loudoun County and let them know there is a God in Israel. Those who live at home in peace and plenty want the duello part of this war to go on. But when they have to bear their burden by loss of property and comforts, they will cry for peace." Sheridan sent his cavalry into the county with orders to make it untenable for a Confederate army to subsist in the area. The citizens had given too many meals to guerrillas to have any sympathy from Sheridan. For 4 days, Merritt's 4,000 cavalrymen desolated the countryside and filled the sky with black smoke. They spared the Unionist Quakers when they could, but no one else, slogging through slush, sleet, and snow to carry out their grim task. When the mission ended, Merritt's men had driven off or destroyed 3,000 to 4,000 sheep, 5,000 to 6,000 cattle, and nearly 1,000 hogs. They seized between 500 and 700 horses. A forage depot and several hundred tons of hay were destroyed, along with barns, stables, smokehouses, and corn cribs. Losses totaled millions of dollars. Despite the destruction that Sheridan sanctioned on the Shenandoah Valley and other places in Virginia under his jurisdiction, he exhibited a soft side as well. On Christmas Day, 1864, Sheridan requested permission for the War Department to distribute army supplies to citizens in the valley who were starving. The request was denied, but later that winter, emergency supplies were brought into Winchester for distribution. On February 27th, Sheridan set out to destroy what was left of Jubal Early's army. Robert E. Lee drained Early's command of troops to help protect Richmond and Petersburg, so all Early had left was about 1,500 infantry and around 500 cavalry. The old Confederates set up a defensive position northwest of Waynesboro to confront Sheridan. Union cavalry overran Early's left flank and scattered his forces. The Confederate Army of the Valley was virtually destroyed. Sheridan was determined to see the last throes of the Confederacy and went to join Ulysses S. Grant at Petersburg. As he moved through central Virginia, he wrecked the James River Canal and the Virginia Central Railroad, pressing on to the northern perimeter of Richmond, then south across the James River to where the Army of the Potomac was laying siege to the Army of Northern Virginia at Petersburg. Sheridan met with Grant, and the general-in-chief suggested that Sheridan would take the cavalry corps to meet up with William T. Sherman, who was moving through the Carolinas. Sheridan protested and insisted on staying with Grant to end the siege of Petersburg. When Sherman came to visit with Grant at City Point to discuss strategy, Sheridan became so afraid that Sherman would change Grant's mind about going to the Carolinas that Sheridan went to City Point, finding the two men still discussing strategy at midnight. Sheridan stuck up for himself and protested being sent to Sherman's army. The next morning, Sherman came to Sheridan's tent and tried again to convince Little Phil to join his army, but Sheridan was unmoved. At the very end of March, Grant proposed to Sheridan to move his cavalry corps to the far right flank of the Confederate army and threaten the last supply routes into Petersburg and Richmond. Sheridan moved his horsemen to Dinwiddie Court House in an attempt to draw the Confederates out of their entrenchments. At the town, Sheridan and his staff stayed in the hotel and tavern. There they met two women who evacuated Charleston, South Carolina, when Sherman marched to the sea and were on their way to Petersburg, but were stuck at Dinwiddie. The two ladies asked that Sheridan not fight a battle near the hotel to spare them from witnessing the carnage. The Union officers agreed to spare them from it. That night the ladies served them coffee, and the group gathered around an out-of-tune piano to sing popular songs and eat berries. The officers slept on the floor once the festivities subsided. As the rain came pouring down, making it difficult for horses, men, and wagons to travel through the Virginia landscape, Grant sent a message to Sheridan, telling him that the rains will prevent them from continuing the operation. The message horrified Sheridan, who didn't want to stop the operation. He didn't respond by letter. Instead, he rode to Grant's headquarters at Gravelly Run. Upon arriving, Grant's staff surrounded Sheridan to hear what he had to say. He told them that it was a mistake to pull back, and that I can drive the whole cavalry force of the enemy with ease, and if an infantry force is added to my command, I can strike out for Lee's right, and either crush it or force him to so weaken his entrenched lines that our troops in front of them can break through and march into Petersburg. When an officer asked how he could obtain food for his horses, Sheridan responded, "I'll haul it out. If I have to set every man in the command to corduroy every mile of them from the railroad to Dinwiddie, I tell you I'm ready to strike out tomorrow and go to smashing things." Grant heard Sheridan's arguments and agreed to let Sheridan continue the operation. Sheridan's horsemen were on the road between Dinwiddie Court House and Five Forks, a major crossroads. The Confederate force sent to combat him was commanded by George Pickett. With 5 brigades of infantry, some cavalry, and artillery, Pickett began to push against Sheridan's cavalry, driving them back toward Dinwiddie. Outside of the town, Sheridan halted his men and defended the area, and prevented Pickett from pushing them any further. Sheridan initially wanted the 6th Corps to help him attack Pickett, but Grant told him it was too far away to get to him in time. The next closest corps was the 5th Corps under Gouverneur K. Warren. Warren sent 1 division ahead, but those troops were stopped by the Confederates. Nightfall brought an end to the fighting as the Confederates pulled back to Five Forks. On April 1st, Warren came to Sheridan to discuss future plans. Sheridan began to sketch out a battle plan in the dirt with his saber. The cavalry would hold the enemy in place until Warren could get onto the left flank of Pickett's line. Then both would attack and isolate the Virginians' force. Sheridan urged Warren to make haste, but Warren moved slowly. An hour after Warren left Sheridan's presence, a messenger came to Sheridan from Grant, informing him that Grant gave Sheridan full authority to relieve Warren if he deemed a 5th Corps division commander more capable in commanding the corps. 3 hours passed, but there was no firing on Warren's front. Sheridan's cavalry could possibly run out of ammunition before Warren made the attack. Sheridan rode to Warren and found his corps had only moved 2 miles in those 3 hours and were still half a mile away from where he was supposed to attack Pickett. Sheridan went up to Warren, who was drawn in the dirt. Sheridan urged him to move quicker, but Warren didn't make any effort to encourage his men and officers to increase their step. As more time passed, Sheridan made every possible appeal for promptness. Dismounted from his horse, paced up and down. struck the clenched fist of one hand against the palm of the other, and fretted like a caged tiger. At 4 p.m., the 5th Corps was ready to attack. The Confederate leadership, including Pickett and the cavalry commanders, were at a shadbake, not aware of the impending disaster about to befall them. When Warren launched his attack, it overwhelmed the left flank of Pickett's line. Sheridan ordered his dismounted cavalry forward, putting added pressure on the rebels. Sheridan observed part of Warren's corps, Romaine Ayres's division, beginning to waver. Sheridan feared that the division would fall back and ruin the attack, so he charged into the group of men with his standard in one hand and told the blue troops to smash them, go at them with a will, move on at a clean jump, or you'll not catch one of them. When a gap emerged in the Union line, it was filled with the brigade of Joshua Chamberlain. Sheridan watched Chamberlain lead his men forward at the front of his troops. Sheridan declared, "By God, that's what I want to see, general officers at the front." One soldier fell to the ground in front of Sheridan, clutching his neck when a ball pierced his jugular. The shot man yelled, "I'm killed." Sheridan rode up and said, "You're not hurt a bit. Pick up your gun, man, and move right to the front." This inspired the wounded man to pick up his musket, run a dozen steps, and then fell dead from blood loss. Sheridan was at a loss as to Warren's whereabouts. It was Sheridan who rallied Ayres's division. It was Sheridan who ordered in Charles Griffin's division when a gap emerged in the Union battle line. Warren was nowhere to be found. The corps commander had followed his 3rd Division, which had gotten off course, and corrected it, getting into the rear of the Confederates. Warren sent a messenger to tell Sheridan where he was, but it was too late. Sheridan was livid. Sheridan told the messenger, "By God, sir, tell General Warren he wasn't in that fight." Shortly afterward, Sheridan told Warren he was relieved of command, and Charles Griffin would take command of the 5th Corps. Warren would later go to Sheridan's headquarters and ask him to reconsider the order. Sheridan responded, "Reconsider? Hell, I don't reconsider my determinations." Warren would fight to save his reputation for the rest of his life. The Battle of Five Forks ended in a great victory for Sheridan, completely routing Pickett's men. One man told Sheridan that he believed Sheridan exposed himself in battle more than a corps commander should. Sheridan responded, "I have never in my life taken a command into battle and had the slightest desire to come out alive unless I won." The next day, the Union Army burst through the Confederate defenses of Petersburg, sending the Army of Northern Virginia and the Confederate government fleeing from Richmond and its environs. The chase began as the rebel army moved west, attempting to locate supplies and hopefully link up with Joseph E. Johnston and the Army of Tennessee and North Carolina. Sheridan and his cavalry followed Lee's army closely and attempted to cut the Confederates off from any assistance that may be found in southern Virginia. The Union Army of the Potomac was right behind. At Jetersville, Sheridan received the news he dreaded. The Union Army commander George Meade ordered him to halt at Jetersville and await the rest of the army before pursuing. Sheridan fretted that this would waste valuable time. He didn't respond to Meade, but wrote to Grant. Grant hurried to the front and met with Sheridan at his makeshift headquarters in a log cabin in the middle of a tobacco field. The men coming into the headquarters woke Sheridan up, and the sleepy-eyed general began to lay out maps, explaining where he thought Lee was headed and where he believed his cavalry could cut Lee off. Grant agreed and had Meade countermand his order. Sheridan would march west, shadowing Lee's army and blocking him from heading south. As Lee's columns marched west, Longstreet's corps pulled away from the rest of the army, producing a sizable gap. Sheridan exploited that gap and helped to trap the corps of Richard Anderson and Richard Ewell that resulted in the Battle of Sailor's Creek. Sheridan's cavalry corps fought alongside the 6th Corps under Horatio Wright, the same corps that helped turn the tide for Sheridan at Cedar Creek. During the fight, Sheridan told his subordinates, "Never mind your flanks, go through them. They're demoralized as hell." The Confederates broke, and Sheridan and the other Union soldiers captured thousands of prisoners. Sheridan wrote to Grant that, "If the thing is pressed, I think that Lee will surrender." Grant sent the message to President Lincoln, and he telegraphed back, "Let the thing be pressed." During Sheridan's pursuit of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, Little Phil came to the home of a middle-aged Southern man. The general sat on the step of the house, lit a cigar, and began to converse with the owner of the home, who sat in a chair on the porch. Sheridan asked if Lee's troops had passed by. The Southerner defiantly delivered a little speech about his loyalty to the Confederacy. After unrolling a map, Sheridan then asked how far away Buffalo Creek was. The man said he didn't know. Sheridan then asked how long the man had lived there. The reply came, "All my life." "Very well, sir, it's time you did know," Sheridan replied. The man was put under guard and walked the 5 miles to Buffalo Creek, all in his slippers. Through hard riding and the determination of their leader, Sheridan's cavalry got ahead of Robert E. Lee's army, ready to intercept them at Appomattox Station. Sheridan denied the Confederate army an avenue west and south, but Little Phil feared that Lee might try to break out and head to Lynchburg, a major location on the railroad. He hoped that more Union infantry could come to the station because he believed that if Lee determined to move through Appomattox Station, the cavalry alone couldn't stop the rebels. From April 8th to the morning of the 9th, Sheridan and his troops got little sleep, mostly staying under arms and facing east, ready to pounce on the retreating foe. Later that morning, Sheridan observed a white flag of truce. He began to ride toward Appomattox Court House, but came under fire. He waved his hat and yelled that there was a truce, but the firing continued. He ducked into a swell and followed it to the village. He soon ran into Confederate General John Brown Gordon. More firing could be heard by the Confederates, directed toward Sheridan's troops. Little Phil asked Gordon about the continued hostilities, then said, "We might as well let them fight it out." Gordon replied, "There must be some mistake." The firing eventually subsided. Gordon later commented about this interaction with Sheridan, writing, "While never discourteous, were far less agreeable and pleasing than those of any other officers of the Union Army whom it was my fortune to meet. There was an absence of that delicacy and consideration which was exhibited by other Union officers." Sheridan was despondent about the surrender. He wanted to utterly destroy the rebel army. He paced unhappily when some of Grant's staff approached him. Little Phil said, "I wish they had held out an hour longer, and I would have whipped hell out of them." Later, Sheridan held up a clenched fist and remarked, I've got 'em like that." As more details about the truce made it to all parties, Sheridan waited on the outskirts of the village. Grant came riding up, and pleasantries were exchanged. Grant asked if Lee was there, referring to the little community a short ride away. Sheridan replied that he was in a brick home just up the road. Grant replied, "Come, let us go over." At the Wilmer McLean home, Grant climbed the stairs with Sheridan, Orville Babcock, and Edward Ord. Inside the home, Sheridan was introduced to Lee. Then Sheridan left the room to wait on the porch as the two men, along with aides, helped draft the surrender. Once done, Sheridan returned to the parlor. Most officers treated Lee with reverence, except Sheridan. Sheridan asked Lee to return some dispatches sent to him that morning, protesting being fired upon by the rebels during the flag of truce. Sheridan had failed to make copies and wanted the originals. Lee reached into his breast pocket, pulled out the dispatches, and returned them, saying, "I am sorry. It is probable that my cavalry at that point of the line did not fully understand the agreement." Lee and Grant left the house, and Union officers began a bidding war for McLean's furniture. Sheridan bought the table where Grant drafted the terms for 2 $10 gold pieces. He then gave the table to one of his subordinates, George Armstrong Custer, to give to Custer's wife Libby, whom Sheridan had met on a steamer called the River Queen the previous July. Accompanying the gift was a note from Sheridan. "Permit me to say, madam, that there is scarcely an individual in our service who has contributed more to bring this about than your very gallant husband." The next day at 8 a.m., with other generals handling the surrender details, Sheridan marched his cavalry corps 4 abreast through the center of Appomattox Court House on his way east. At night, the horsemen camped in a very strange way, with outposts and pickets. The war's finality rudely began to set in. On his way to Petersburg, Sheridan encamped at Nottoway Courthouse. That night, a telegraph operator noticed a transmission destined for General George Meade, informing him that Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. Sheridan dismissed the report and went back to bed. He would soon find out its validity. When the cavalry corps made it to Petersburg, Sheridan was directed to take his horsemen and the 6th Infantry Corps to North Carolina to aid William T. Sherman in his attempt to destroy the Confederate Army of Tennessee. Sheridan made it to South Boston, Virginia, before he got a message from Washington informing him that Sherman had accepted the surrender of that rebel army. The Blue Column began to retrace its steps back to Petersburg and then to Washington, D.C. When he got to the nation's capital, he found orders naming him commander of all U.S. troops west of the Mississippi River, with the role of bringing Texas and Louisiana back into the Union. Sheridan left his room at the Willard Hotel and walked quickly to see General-in-Chief Grant. Sheridan hoped that he could remain in Washington long enough to lead his cavalry corps in the grand review scheduled in a few days. Grant informed Sheridan that he must leave immediately, that the situation in Texas needed his attention. Confederate General Edmund Kirby Smith commanded rebel troops in that area, and Mexico, particularly the Mexican government under Maximilian of France, was aiding the Confederacy. Sheridan needed to proceed to the Rio Grande and stop the rebel exodus and help the Mexicans opposing Maximilian, led by Benito Juarez. Sheridan left Washington, destined for St. Louis, then proceeded to New Orleans, Louisiana. But before reaching New Orleans, he got a telegram informing him that Smith had surrendered on May 26th. This solved one of Sheridan's objectives, but he still needed to secure the border. In New Orleans, he organized the forces under his command, numbering over 50,000 men, and dispersed them throughout Texas. He himself rode to the border and rattled his saber, demonstrating to the imperialists on the Mexican side that he intended to commence hostilities. William Seward, the Secretary of State, didn't want to bring about a war and urged diplomacy to solve the problems between the U.S. and the imperialist government in Mexico. Grant covertly told Sheridan to conduct a Cold War against Mexico. Sheridan went to work, spread misinformation to the Mexican side, arming Mexican insurgents, and moved his troops around to threaten Maximilian. The show of force worked, and the French imperialists withdrew troops from many points in northern Mexico. Juarez's presidential term ended in December 1865, which created a power vacuum within the Mexican Republican government. 3 men vied for the position, but Grant liked Jose Maria Carbajal. Grant told Sheridan to give him as much aid as he could, but regretted that he couldn't give him direct aid. Carbajal was quickly deposed, and Servando Canales attempted to take the reins. Unimpressed with either man, Sheridan put his support behind Juarez, the former president. A combination of Sheridan's aid to the insurgents and the expansion of Prussia in Europe convinced the French to pull their troops out of Mexico, and without the backing by France, Maximilian was deposed and executed by firing squad. Sheridan's political battles along the Mexican border gave way to political battles within the United States once Maximilian was gone. President Andrew Johnson and Congress fought bitterly over who would coordinate Reconstruction of the South. Sheridan noticed that when ex-Confederates regained political power in Louisiana, that the African Americans were at the mercy of a people who, recently their masters, now seemed to look upon them as the authors of all the misfortunes that had come upon the land. Texas became a lawless area as Sheridan's army size shrunk and the ex-Confederates began to take over the state governments in that state as well. When a reporter asked Sheridan how he liked Texas, he said, "If I owned hell in Texas, I would rent out Texas and live in hell." In mid-1866, Sheridan returned to New Orleans only to find that a violent event had occurred at the Mechanics' Institute, when whites had attacked a group of black and white men meeting to elect delegates for Louisiana's Constitutional Convention. Sheridan felt deeply for the newly freedmen. He wrote, "Their freedom had been given them, and it was the plain duty of those in authority to make it secure, and screen them from the bitter political resentment that beset them, and to see that they had a fair chance in the battle of life." Grant wrote to Sheridan and asked him some questions that President Johnson wanted answered about the riot in New Orleans. Sheridan pointed the finger at general uneasiness across the city and the state, and singled out a judge who gave the perpetrators assurance that nothing judicial would happen to them in its aftermath. When Johnson released part of Sheridan's report, it turned many of the ex-Confederates even more against Sheridan and the federal authorities. Sheridan felt as though Johnson had a vendetta against him. Congress took charge of Reconstruction and established 5 military districts to govern the southern states. Sheridan was placed in command of the 5th Military District, overseeing Texas and Louisiana. Before March 1867 ended, Sheridan issued General Orders No. 1 to Louisiana and Texas. It made clear that the military now wielded veto power over all civilian government actions. Sheridan proceeded to remove the New Orleans judge and 2 elected officials whom he had long had in his sights for their roles in the riot. He had the authority for these actions under yet another supplemental Reconstruction Act, again passed over Johnson's veto, permitting district military commanders to remove any civil official who impeded Reconstruction. Sheridan stretched his authority to cover many aspects of civil life. He got rid of disloyal officials. He integrated public transportation, and he helped put former Union soldiers in as police officers. When the Louisiana governor got under Sheridan's skin by obstructing his Reconstruction objectives, he replaced him with someone else. Sheridan grew to despise the ex-rebels. He wrote, "If I am disliked, it is because I cannot and will not cater to rebel sentiment. It was of no consequence to him whether the Southern states were readmitted tomorrow or kept out for 20 years. The more I see of these people, the less I see to admire." Texas was also under Sheridan's thumb. When Galveston wanted to hold a funeral for Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston as they brought the remains to Austin for burial, Sheridan overruled the parade. When the town's citizens paid homage by marching in silence, Sheridan removed the town's mayor. Sheridan reported to Grant about Texas that the condition of freemen and Union men in remote parts of the state is truly horrible. The government is denounced, the freedmen are shot, and Union men are persecuted if they have the temerity to express their opinion. My own opinion is that the trial of a white man for the murder of a freeman in Texas would be a farce. Because of violence against Unionist blacks and Federal soldiers, Sheridan removed the Texas governor complicit in those actions and put in place a Unionist governor. Sheridan's actions got the attention of the president, who in turn ordered the removal of Sheridan from that military district and reassigned him to the Department of the Missouri. Johnson declared that Sheridan's rule over Texas and Louisiana has in fact been one of absolute tyranny without reference to the principles of our government or the nature of our free institutions, a resort to authority not granted by law. He reported to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas in August 1867, but took a few months of leave to visit family and friends, then went to Washington, D.C. to work with General William T. Sherman in putting together the Army Code of Regulations and Articles of War. He left the capital in February 1868, destined for Fort Leavenworth. In this department, Sheridan would be dealing with Native Americans rather than ex-Confederates. The Medicine Lodge Treaty signed between the United States and multiple tribes would relocate numerous tribes to the Indian Territory, and the government would give them supplies. When some relocated, they ended up starving because Congress was delayed in ratifying the treaty, thus no food was sent to the groups. Some tribes began to lash out against white settlers, and some formed hunting parties to prevent their starvation. Some, like the Cheyenne, began to attack white settlers. Their dog soldiers would become the main target for Sheridan. He got permission from Sherman to forcibly remove the tribes to the reservations and to attack the perpetrators of atrocities on the frontier. To catch the Indians unaware, Sheridan planned a winter expedition to attack their encampments. As usual, Sheridan planned incredibly well. He studied weather patterns in previous years to know what to expect and consulted scouts and frontiersmen to guide his strategy in assaulting the camps of various tribes, but particularly the Cheyenne. In November 1868, Sheridan let loose his subordinate George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry on a village where Chief Blackkettle was staying. The chief and many men, women, and children were killed in the raid planned by Sheridan and perpetrated by Custer. Although it gets the name of the Battle of Washita, it resembled more of a massacre. Sheridan visited the village after the battle and intended on attacking more villages. He received information that 2 chiefs, Satanta and Lone Wolf, were nearby and would agree to meet with him. Sheridan rode to the Kiowa village where the 2 men were, along with 2,000 cavalry, to impress upon them the power Sheridan had. Little Phil declared, "I am now your chief, and you must obey me. I am just as much your chief as you are the chiefs of your people." Sheridan's words and imposing army convinced both chiefs to become cooperative, agreeing to move to Fort Cobb. However, groups from the tribe began to leave, and soon only a handful remained to travel to the fort. Sheridan caught Satanta and Lone Wolf, holding them at Fort Cobb. Sheridan made a declaration that if the tribe didn't come to the fort within 48 hours, he would execute the 2 chiefs. It was a nerve-wracking 2 days for both men, but the Kiowas began to return. Sheridan rounded up other tribes with the threat of annihilation, gaining fear from the various Native American groups, but with his own men, he had gained a great respect. One man admired him for camping in a tent when the weather was fair or foul, marching at our head in snow and rain, enduring all the hardships of wind and weather. He is not a young man, either between 35 and 40 years old. At the end of this campaign, he had subdued multiple tribes, and a shining endorsement awaited him. President-elect Ulysses S. Grant informed Sheridan that upon his inauguration as president, Sheridan would be promoted to lieutenant general, and William T. Sherman would go on to replace Grant as the general of all U.S. forces. With his promotion, Sheridan now commanded the military division of the Missouri, commanding essentially all the troops from Chicago to the Rocky Mountains, and from the Canadian border to Texas. His first action as the new commander was to move the headquarters from St. Louis to Chicago. Since troops and supplies were now transported by rail rather than river, the United States' railroad hub seemed like a better location for that division. The 38-year-old quickly became the hit of the city because of his sociability and fame. To better engross himself into Chicago society, he took dancing lessons. His teacher was the wife of George Pullman, the inventor of the railroad sleeping car. George himself was a classmate of Sheridan, along with the department store magnate Marshall Field and Robert Todd Lincoln. When Ulysses S. Grant went in as president, he changed the policies regarding Native Americans. It was a policy of peace and determined to treat them as wards of the government, not as separate entities. This enraged a lot of people. Sheridan had been dealing with tribes in a violent way, particularly when pursuing those groups who attacked white settlers. As lieutenant general, he did not lead campaigns anymore, he just planned them. In January 1870, Sheridan got a wake-up call when federal troops, led by Eugene Baker, attacked the wrong village while chasing a rogue band of Indians in Montana. The camp was full of sick men, women, and children, mostly with smallpox. Over 50 of the dead after the attack were women and children. It was a horrible tragedy, and it horrified even supporters of Sheridan. Sheridan wasn't one to take criticism lightly, though. Although he realized that the attack was a mistake, he lashed back, writing, "During the war, did anyone hesitate to attack a village or town occupied by the enemy because women or children were within its limits? Did we cease to throw shells into Vicksburg or Atlanta because women and children were there?" A former comment made by Sheridan made it into the newspapers that threw more gas on the fire. At a meeting with Plains Indians at Fort Cobb, Sheridan told one chief that the only good Indians he ever saw were dead. The Baker Massacre, as well as these comments, helped convince the public and Congress that the Indian Bureau shouldn't be transferred to the War Department from the Department of the Interior, as had previously been discussed. In 1870, Sheridan got word of war breaking out in Europe between Prussia and France. Sheridan asked for permission from William T. Sherman and Grant to go to Europe as a spectator. It was happily granted. Sheridan sailed for Europe and made his way to Berlin to meet the Queen of Prussia, but word of an imminent battle drug him away from that meeting. He rode in a hay wagon to the front, where he met Otto von Bismarck and King William I. He made a good impression on all in attendance and gained high marks for his quick eye during an engagement. At one point, Sheridan went into a nearby town looking to get something to eat, but was surrounded by some angry Prussian soldiers who mistook his U.S. Army uniform as a French uniform. A member of King William's party came by, saw the predicament Sheridan was in, and extricated him. Sheridan would write, "I thought my hour had come, for they could not understand English, and I could not speak German." Sheridan was given a pass from the king so he could travel anywhere without harassment. While observing the Franco-Prussian War, Sheridan got to know Bismarck very well and called him a friend by the end of his observation. They swapped hunting stories and discussed military history. While surveying a battlefield, they found some wounded men whom the stretcher bearers had missed. Sheridan and Bismarck gave them water and stayed with them until help came. As the Prussian army moved into France, they were attacked by French guerrilla forces. Uncertain at how to handle them, Sheridan's advice was sought at a dinner party. He declared, "The proper strategy consists, in the first place, in inflicting as telling blows as possible upon the enemy's army, and then in causing the inhabitants so much suffering that they must long for peace and for their government to demand it. The people must be left with nothing but their eyes to weep with after the war." In Sheridan's personal memoirs, he mused, "I can but leave to conjecture how the Germans would have gotten along through the swamps and quicksands of northern Virginia. There is nothing to be learned here professionally, but it is a satisfaction that such is the case. There is much, however, which Europeans could learn from us. Sheridan took a grand tour of Europe while the French defended Paris, visiting Vienna and Constantinople, then Greece and Italy. In Italy, the king was an avid hunter and invited Sheridan to hunt in his royal game preserve. Sheridan had hunted in the plains and the Rockies and found the preserve very tame. He killed 4 deer from a stand within 15 paces of his position. He was urged to kill more, and he slaughtered 7 more in quick succession. He didn't feel it much sport, but tried to make his host happy. Sheridan returned to Paris to watch the Prussian army march into the city, then left to tour England and Ireland. Upon returning to the U.S., a staff surgeon and his brother had organized a hunting expedition for prominent figures of the time, including a New York financier named Leonard Jerome, the future grandfather of Winston Churchill. For entertainment and scouting, Sheridan hired his most trusted scout, the 25-year-old William Cody, soon to become Buffalo Bill Cody. 3 years before, Cody impressed Sheridan by delivering messages through Indian Territory covering 350 miles in 60 hours. The expedition went into the plains killing 600 bison and an untold amount of antelope, elk, deer, and turkeys. The success of that hunt prompted another one. President Grant wanted Sheridan to take Russia's Grand Duke Alexis, a son of Tsar Alexander II, on a hunt. Sheridan organized a cavalry escort for the Grand Duke and received reports from his subordinates by telegraph where herds of bison were. During one of these hunts, Sheridan fell from his horse. The hunting party came blazing away at the herd behind Sheridan, to the point that he had to throw himself on the ground to protect him from the flying projectiles. In between these 2 hunts, Sheridan had to deal with the Great Chicago Fire. As the fire progressed through the city, Sheridan ordered buildings intentionally destroyed to create breaks. Then, with the city decimated and tens of thousands of residents without homes, Sheridan brought in army rations for the populace. To maintain order, Sheridan's troops and local police began to patrol the streets to keep law and order. Sheridan's headquarters was destroyed, destroying with it his Civil War papers, journals, and other irreplaceable material. His home, however, was spared. It became a refuge for Army officers, including Colonel Daniel Rucker, the quartermaster general, his wife, and his daughter Irene. Back on the plains, Native Americans who did move to reservations were left to starve, being unable to survive on the land provided them. Their attempts at growing crops ran into horrible droughts that devastated the reservations. With no other choice, many left the reservations to hunt bison, as they had for hundreds of years. Sheridan supported the policy of destroying the bison herds by the military and private individuals in order to get rid of the Indian population. When Texas was debating a bill to help save the bison herds, Sheridan told them that Texas should issue all the bison hunters a medal with a dead bison on one side and a discouraged Indian on the other. He told the Texas legislators that buffalo hunters have done more in the last 2 years to settle the vexed Indian question than the entire regular army has done in the past 30 years. They are destroying the Indians' commissary, and it is a well-known fact that an army losing its base of supplies is placed at a great disadvantage. Send them powder and lead if you will, but, for the sake of lasting peace, let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffaloes are exterminated. Then your prairies can be covered with speckled cattle and the festive cowboy, who follows the hunter as a second forerunner of an advanced civilization. Sheridan didn't let international borders stop him from pursuing rogue tribes. When a group of Kickapoos crossed the Rio Grande and raided Texas villages, Sheridan wanted the group destroyed. For the illegal mission, he chose Randall McKenzie and his 4th Cavalry. McKenzie served in the Union Army during the war, fought at 2nd Manassas, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and during Sheridan's time in the Valley. He also fought alongside Sheridan at 5 Forks in the Appomattox Campaign. He was known as Three-Fingered Jack because a Confederate artillery shell tore off 2 fingers on one of his hands. To Indians, they knew him as Bad Hand. Sheridan told McKenzie about the mission, and McKenzie was skeptical of its legality. Sheridan slammed his fist on his desk and told him not to worry about its legality. McKenzie had his full support, as well as the support of Ulysses S. Grant. In May 1873, McKenzie crossed the Rio Grande, destroyed the Kickapoo village, killing at least 19 women, children, and old men, then returned to Texas with 40 prisoners after burning the village. When Sherman found out about the raid, He told Sheridan he didn't approve. Sheridan defended his actions in a report stating, "If the Mexican authorities cannot or will not protect our citizens from the attacks of Indians and freebooters from their side of the river, then it is the duty of the Lieutenant General to see that they are so protected." Mackenzie and others would be part of a major campaign designed by Sheridan to rid the Southwest of Native Americans. He planned for an all-out attack across multiple fronts, pushing the tribes west. His orders were to push the enemy to their breaking point, and they did. The climactic battle happened at a huge canyon, Palo Duro. The U.S. Army destroyed lodges, killed numerous warriors, and captured 1,500 ponies. The Army chose the best 350 and shot the rest. Mackenzie and the others pushed west, and by early 1875, hundreds of Native Americans began surrendering to various military installations. Sheridan's 1874 campaign had worked brilliantly. At the end of 1874, the Secretary of War, William Belknap, ordered Sheridan to New Orleans, Louisiana to remove 5 Democrats from the State House of Representatives who filled 5 disputed seats. Sheridan entered the city and with fixed bayonets removed the 5 Democrats. His return to New Orleans was met with hatred and hostility. At breakfast in his hotel, other guests would underline derogatory statements about Sheridan in newspapers and send them by a waiter to the general. Sheridan would read it, smile, and nod at the sender, not letting the words bother him. In June 1875, Sheridan's life changed. He got married. The bride was Irene Rucker, the daughter of the Army officer whom Sheridan let stay at his home following the Chicago fire. They began a courtship a few years after she and her family had stayed at his home, and by 1875, Sheridan asked her to marry him. Sheridan was 44, while Irene was 19. They were married in Chicago at the Rucker home in a private ceremony. Gold was found in the Black Hills of what is now South Dakota, on sacred land to the Sioux. Sheridan and the rest of the Army High Command decided not to stop prospectors from invading the Sioux lands, and it became open for white settlement. The Great Sioux War erupted on the northern Great Plains, and Sheridan hoped to deal with those tribes who banded together the same way he dealt with the ones in the southern plains, pushing them to the point of exhaustion. His army was to converge on the bands from the south, east, and west, delivering devastating attacks that would knock them into submission. It was July 4th in Philadelphia, and the city hosted the Centennial International Exposition. Both General Sherman and Sheridan enjoyed the festivities, but later that day a message came for Sheridan and Sherman. It reported Custer's 7th Cavalry had been wiped out. The news devastated Sheridan, who had come to depend on Custer for so many of his operations. Sheridan wrote, "Poor Custer, he was the embodiment of gallantry, but I was always fearful that he would catch it if allowed a separate command. He was too impetuous, without deliberation. He thought himself invincible, and having a charmed life. When I think of the many brave fellows who went down with him that day, it is sickening." If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Following the death of George Armstrong Custer and his men at the Battle of Little Bighorn in June 1876, Sheridan reinvigorated his efforts to wipe out the Native Americans not yet on reservations. His trusted subordinate, Randall Mackenzie, led many of those efforts, driving the renegade bands to the point of exhaustion and either chasing them to Canada or forcing them to surrender. At the end of 1876, Sheridan went to Louisiana under orders from the president to safeguard the canvassing agents who investigated the presidential election of 1876 in that state. Although the citizens feared Sheridan was there for other reasons, he simply made sure the agents were safe and then returned back to Chicago. The election ushered in President Rutherford B. Hayes and the end of Reconstruction. In 1877, Sheridan went on a trip to look over the Little Bighorn battlefield, wanting to preserve it as a national cemetery to the fallen members of the 7th Cavalry. But his preservation efforts overflowed into other areas as well. Sheridan was a huge proponent of Yellowstone National Park. As early as 1870, Sheridan had been a prominent figure in exploring a place many people called Wonderland for its geysers and hot springs. Sheridan ordered its mapping and surveying by Army and private individuals. During one of these expeditions, a mountain was named after him, Mount Sheridan, in Yellowstone National Park. The park was created by Congress in 1872 and a superintendent named, but with no salary. The superintendent had to work elsewhere and rarely visited the park. Expeditions into the park saw thousands of carcasses of animals strewn over the landscape and vandalism to the rock formations. Sheridan stood up for the protection of the park, writing, "If authorized to do so, I will engage to keep out skin hunters and all other hunters by use of troops, and, if necessary, I can keep sufficient troops in the park to accomplish this object and give a place of refuge and safety for our noble game." As one of Sheridan's biographers commented, superficially, Sheridan's impassioned defense of the park wildlife appeared to be at odds with his earlier support for the annihilation of the Great Plains buffalo. But in Sheridan's view, there was no inconsistency. Two wholly different issues were involved. The buffalo slaughter was necessary to suppress the Plains Indians. The wild game slaughtered in Yellowstone served a narrow commercial interest and outraged his sensibilities as a lifelong hunter and former amateur ornithologist. After many of the tribes were subdued, Sheridan began to look at the Native Americans a little differently. He saw that the contractors hired by the government were withholding food purchases that the government had made for the reservations, and then pocketed the money. This corruption angered Sheridan, who wrote, "Many of the troubles that have occurred on the frontier have grown out of bad feeling, superinduced by want of need of supplies." In his official report he wrote, "We have occupied the Indian's country, taken away from him his lovely domain, destroyed his herds of game, penned him up on reservations, and reduced him to poverty. For humanity's sake, then let us give him enough to eat, and integrity in the agents over him." These accusations angered the Secretary of the Department of the Interior, and a congressional investigation was held to see if there was any validity in Sheridan's accusations about fraud in the government. Sheridan defended himself and the Army well in the investigation. Sheridan, one of the most famous Indian fighters in the United States, began to feel pity for the Native Americans that he had helped put on reservations, as indicated by the statements in his report. He decided to sponsor an ethnological study of the Plains Indians' culture before it went away. In 1883, the President chose Sheridan to arbitrate a dispute between cattlemen and the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders. 7 cattlemen convinced the chiefs of those tribes to sign a lease for 2.4 million acres of land at 2 cents an acre. The tribes didn't agree with what their chiefs had done, and the chiefs regretted their decision. It was nearly breaking out into open warfare when Sheridan arrived on the scene. Sheridan heard both sides' argument and advised the president to remove the cattlemen from the Indian Territory, and he did. President Chester A. Arthur visited Yellowstone during an expedition led by Sheridan in 1883, becoming the first U.S. president to visit the park. The party hunted and fished on the way to Yellowstone, but abstained from those activities while on the park boundary. The group marveled at the geysers, waterfalls, and other natural wonders. Sheridan's brother Michael wrote that General Sheridan was particularly gratified with what the journey had accomplished toward benefiting the park, gaining for its future protection not only the goodwill of his influential guests, but interesting the public in its preservation to such a degree that it became comparatively easy to induce Congress to safeguard it from speculators and plunderers. Also in 1883, William T. Sherman said he would retire from the Army in February 1884. This would promote Sheridan to command all the armies of the United States. The transition would take place in November 1883, with Sherman staying on for 3 months to instruct Sheridan in his new role. Sheridan had lived in Chicago for about 16 years. It was where he was married to Irene and where their 4 children were born, but now he had to move to Washington, D.C. The move was made easier by his wealthy friends in Chicago pooling their money together and buying him a $44,000 house in Washington, D.C. The family moved there as Sheridan embarked on his new adventure. Sheridan found that his new role was considerably weakened by the power of the Secretary of War. All his departmental commanders sent their reports directly to the Secretary instead of Sheridan. This didn't seem to bother him, though. The comfortable salary, the good home life, and more relaxed work made him enjoy the role. Without having to worry about his departments, he kept up his predecessor's initiative of modernizing the Army. He upgraded the artillery school at Fort Monroe, Virginia, got more money for the School of Application for Cavalry and Infantry at Fort Leavenworth, and became president of the National Rifle Association to promote marksmanship. As the leader of the army, he was at special events, like the unveiling of the Washington Monument and the Statue of Liberty. He attended veterans' reunions and was a pallbearer for Ulysses S. Grant and Chester A. Arthur. The Sheridan at the end of the Civil War, or chasing Indians across the prairie, was far different than the man who walked the streets of the capital. One reporter described him in great detail. He wore upon the back of his round, bullet head an old-fashioned silk hat about 2 sizes too small, a short, light yellow-gray overcoat which had only 2 buttons, and they were ready to fly off from the undue strain of Sheridan's round figure. The trousers were a gray plaid and fitted very snugly on the general's fat legs. His boots were thick-soled and unblackened. In November 1887, Sheridan complained to his doctor that he had felt unwell for months, that he was flush and short of breath. The doctor gave him the bad news that he had heart disease. He kept pressing on with his work, though, going out to the west for an inspection tour. But when he returned in May 1888, he felt ill and exhausted and suffered a severe heart attack. He experienced several more in the following days. Sheridan suffered another heart attack in June, and he was moved to a summer cottage in Nonquit, Massachusetts, thinking the environment better for him. On August 5, 1888, he suffered a massive heart attack. With Irene by his side, he died at 10:30 p.m. On the 8th, Sheridan's remains were put on a special train destined for Washington, D.C. Once there, he laid in state at St. Matthew's Catholic Church until his funeral on August 11th. The President, Supreme Court justices, senators, and congressmen came to visit the old general and see him one last time. An arrangement of blue and yellow flowers into the shape of a 4-star general insignia adorned the altar. William T. Sherman, one of his pallbearers, along with cavalry officer Wesley Merritt, was also in attendance. When the service concluded, the coffin was laid on a caisson, while the Marine Band played Nearer My God to Thee. The procession took Sheridan's body to Arlington National Cemetery, where he was laid to rest. The last to leave his gravesite was Sherman. Sheridan's death, much like his life, had its proponents and detractors. One newspaper wrote, "It is not to be expected that any lamentations shall be heard in the Valley of Virginia over the death of this officer. They can never forget as long as they live that he resorted to the use of the torch in order to bring them into subjugation." Irene never remarried, dying in 1938, 50 years after her husband's death. She remarked, "I would rather be Phil Sheridan's widow than any living man's wife." Sheridan's 3 girls never married. The last one passed away in 1969. Phil Sheridan, Jr. graduated from West Point in 1902. He was an aide to President Theodore Roosevelt and served on the Army's general staff before passing away in 1918. Philip Sheridan's rise through the United States military can only be characterized as meteoric. He threw himself into his work with an enthusiasm that led to commanders noticing his actions and acknowledging his capabilities. This happened in Mississippi when he got the attention of his superiors, and he became a brigade commander, then quickly rose to division command. At Missionary Ridge, Ulysses S. Grant recognized the tenacity of Sheridan, and this put little Phil on a trajectory that resulted in him surpassing numerous other officers in the Army of the Potomac. Given the chance, Sheridan eliminated the famed cavalry officer Jeb Stuart, and as an Army commander, commanded the Federal force in the Shenandoah Valley. He was able to wrest control of the strategic area away from the Confederacy and eliminated it as a place of sustenance for the Army of Northern Virginia. He contributed significantly in the pursuit of Robert E. Lee's army, forcing that fighting force to surrender at Appomattox Court House. He ruled over Louisiana and the Plains in the post-war years with an iron fist, eliminating ex-Confederate support in Louisiana and Texas, and forcing both the northern and southern Great Plains Indians to enter reservations. His tactics have been criticized for their brutality, garnering hatred from Southerners and Native Americans. He also had compassion, like during the Great Chicago Fire, where he welcomed refugees into his home and worked to relieve the suffering of those who lost their homes and businesses. Sheridan was a complicated man that didn't fit neatly into any box. The United States military's history cannot be complete without mentioning Philip Sheridan, the man who significantly altered both the Civil War and the wars against various Native American tribes in the West, a man of unceasing ambition.